Welcome back. In a moment, we'll continue our discussion with William Perry, but first, here's some other stories to keep an eye on. Donald Trump has approved the U.S. supply of arms to Kurdish forces fighting Daesh in Syria. This comes despite fierce opposition from NATO ally Turkey, which labels the Kurdish YPG militia as terrorists. The move is expected to dominate talks between the two leaders when President Erdogan visits Trump in Washington next week. South Korea's new president, Moon Jae-in, has said he is willing to tackle the difficult task of addressing the nuclear ambitions of North Korea. In his first speech immediately after taking oath of office, Moon said he'll also be negotiating with Washington and Beijing to ease the row over a U.S. missile defense system being deployed in the South. A schoolgirl who was among more than 200 kidnapped by Boko Haram in 2014 refused to be part of a recent release deal because she is now married to a militant fighter. Agencies working close to the case say this scenario is not unusual. There have been repeated calls for more to be done to support those released. Many women have been treated as social outcasts because of their time with the rebels. We're back now with former U.S. Defense Secretary William Perry. Mr. Perry, let me put you on the spot. Do you feel confident with Donald Trump, President Trump, in the White House with his finger on a nuclear button?
I don't feel comfortable with any president having his finger on the nuclear button, but I must say that this particular president makes me more nervous than most because of his lack of experience and because of his temperament.
He's been erratic on foreign policy by a lot of estimates, and wobbly, especially when you talk about NATO and his on-again, off-again support of NATO. First it's obsolete, now most recently in an interview he says it's not obsolete. Does that send a dangerous message to, in particular, say, Russia and Eastern Europe?
I would like to see more consistency from this administration in its foreign policy. I think they're working hard to try to develop that consistency right now, but we're a long way from it.
What kind of message should he be sending to Russia? Russia complains historically. Why is NATO continuing to expand after the fall of the Soviet Union? They're threatening our border, says President Putin. And NATO says, no, wait a minute, we're not threatening Russia. We are forming security around the former Soviet republics and the Baltics, such as Latvia, Lithuania. What's the real story?
I think, in fact, NATO does not pose an aggressive threat to Russia. But it's quite clear that Russia believes that they do. Russia is a nation that's been surrounded by enemies for its entire history. And it has more than once been attacked by those enemies with very serious consequences. So there's perhaps some reason for their paranoia. But I think it is not correct that NATO is a threat to them. It is very much correct that Russia believes they are a threat, and we have to deal with that belief.
What is the point of the NATO alliance now, if it keeps expanding, to defend against whom?
Is to provide, I think, first of all, stability in Europe. It's worth noting that there has not been a war in Europe now for many, many decades, and that is not the historical record that Europe has. And I give NATO a lot of credit for that. So first of all, it has performed that benefit. Secondly, it has been very useful in dealing with crises in Europe. I cite the Bosnia crisis, for example, where hundreds of thousands of people were being killed, the concentration camps in Europe, and NATO very effectively dealt with and solved that problem. They also are dealing with organized terrorism, organized terror groups. Their role in Afghanistan in dealing with al-Qaeda there was a signal accomplishment, I think. So NATO provides an important security function in the world today. Part of that function, though, is not an aggressive expansion into the former Soviet Union. In particular, I do not believe, as I said, that Russia should have any reason to be concerned about NATO attacking it or having any designs on its territory.
I've asked you about President Trump. Let me ask you about President Putin. Some people think he's a menace.
Putin has done a remarkable job in some ways in bringing Russia back on its feet after a very dismal decade of the 90s. Most Russians think of that not as a dismal decade, but as a humiliating decade. And they credit Putin for having restored their national pride. Putin was elected on a platform originally of restoring the Russian pride, restoring the national economy. But the Russian people have paid a very heavy price for that. They've basically lost much of their freedom under Putin, and he's adopted a rather aggressive expansionist policy relative to the former Soviet republics. So I think Putin is representing a real danger to the world today, and we have to understand, first of all, what his reasonable aspirations are, as well as his unreasonable aspirations, and deal with them accordingly. But most of all, we have to understand that Russia is a nation that has many thousands of nuclear weapons, and therefore have a unique danger to the world today. And so as we deal with Russia, we have to find some way of separating out how we deal with them on nuclear weapons and how we deal with their problems in other fields. And it's very difficult to make that separation, but it's necessary to do so. We can disagree with Russia on many, many things that they're doing, but we have to somehow come to an agreement that we cannot let those nuclear weapons lead to a war, and we should be working together to deal with the threats that both of us face relative to proliferation and relative to nuclear terrorism.
You come from an era of, excuse me for using that expression, MAD, which was mutually assured destruction between the former Soviet Union and America. And those old arms control negotiations were always based on parity. But you have written since then, you don't think that we should be sitting with the Russians, and forgive me if I'm misquoting you, but saying, let's not negotiate missile for missile and arms control anymore. How do you do that?
During the Cold War, we were faced with the specter of nuclear annihilation. We tried to deal with that specter through something called mutual assured destruction. And it more or less worked. And it worked in the sense that the Cold War never became a hot war. The danger was always there that the Cold War would explode into a hot war and that civilization would essentially be annihilated. But it didn't happen, and we have to give deterrence some major credit for that happening. But those of us who were planning our deterrence forces then, we had two different criteria for deterrence. One was mutual assured destruction, that we had to have a strong enough force that whatever the Soviet Union did, we could survive and reply to that.
And that's what
mutual assured destruction is all about. That's what gave us our deterrence, and that worked. But we also drifted into something which was called parity, that whatever the Russians did, whatever the Soviet Union did, we had to do it and a little bit better. And that view was also held by the Soviet Union. And over a period of decades, that led to us, the world having the obscene number of 75,000 nuclear weapons. 75,000 nuclear weapons cannot be justified on the basis of deterrence. It could be justified, it only occurred because of the view of both nations that they ought to achieve parity and parity plus. Unfortunately, we seem to be drifting into that point of view again today, where we talk about matching the Russians and doing them a little better, matching them and exceeding them. We're getting into the language of a nuclear arms race again. The last nuclear arms race led to 75,000 nuclear weapons in the world. We should take great pains to see that this one is not. So I would like to distinguish between deterrence on the one hand, which for better or worse we seem to need to maintain today, and parity on the other hand, matching the Soviet Union in the Cold War, and today matching Russia, missile for missile, and then a little bit better. We should try to avoid the psychology that gets into a nuclear arms race again.
Mr. Perry, let me switch quickly to Syria. Russia, Turkey, and Iran want to set up de-escalation zones, they're saying, and ban U.S. aircraft from flying over those zones. What do you really think is at play here? Would you support that? Is that a solution?
Would I support what?
The de-escalation zones proposed by Russia, Turkey, and Iran over Syria? and the grounding of American aircraft? They've called on the U.S. to stop their bombing now. What's your view on Syria?
I don't think I can respond to that precisely. I would say that as long as U.S. and Russian aircraft are both operating in Syria, we need to have some kind of an understanding about and some way of communication so that we don't blunder into some kind of a military conflict. It's very dangerous when you have two sets of military operating in the same region if they're not under a common command, and they're not under common command in Syria. So we have to have some understanding with Russia. I'm not supporting the particular proposal they make, but I think we need to be talking with Russia and understanding how we can work together in Syria, minimizing the chance of some kind of a military conflict through a blunder or through an accident.
Based on what you've seen over the last few years with Russia and their support of al-Assad, do you really think that Russia's being an honest broker here, trying to de-escalate the situation, or do you think that they're using this as a ploy to give more cover to Assad?
No, I don't think that, and I think there are many other areas where we have very sharp disagreements with what Russia is saying and with what Russia is doing. But there's one area we have every reason to agree with Russia, and that's on our nuclear weapons. We have to reach agreement on our nuclear weapons so that they do not lead us to blunder into nuclear war. We have to seize the opportunity to work together with Russia on issues and nuclear issues where we can both agree, which is we do not want nuclear proliferation and we do not want nuclear terrorism. Both nations have those goals, and both nations have the goal of not having a nuclear war. So in those areas, we have to work together. The difficulty is working together with them in the nuclear field while we are confronting them and opposing them in other fields. So we have to have enough wisdom in our diplomacy that we can separate out the problems where we have common interests in the nuclear field from the problems where we have conflicting interests in conventional weapons.
Do you support, my final question to you, this massive modernization of U.S. nuclear forces, which is about to begin including cruise missiles that could be nuclear tipped? Just not the normal triad, but also the triad involving cruise missiles that could carry nuclear tipped missiles. Do you agree with that, or is that something you oppose?
In a perfect world, we would not be building more nuclear weapons at all, but we would be dismantling our nuclear arsenals. And indeed, we had that underway for a period during the 90s. But we're not in a perfect world now, and I reluctantly agree that we need to maintain our deterrence forces. I do not think we should make the mistake of just matching Russia missile for missile, system for system. We should decide what we need for deterrence and build the forces accordingly. Much has changed in technology, much has changed in geopolitics in the last few decades. So as we plan our nuclear forces arsenal today, it should not simply be based on what we had during the Cold War, and it should not simply be based on what the Russians are doing. I think we can maintain quite an adequate deterrence, a very strong and unassailable deterrence, by rebuilding our nuclear submarine forces and by rebuilding our strategic bomber forces. That's what I would favor.
William Perry, the former Secretary of Defense of the United States and a leading figure on arms control around the globe. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you, sir. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Diplomacy instead of an armed showdown with North Korea may have gotten some new traction this week. The new South Korean President, Moon Jae-in, said after his inauguration that he'll take a more assertive role in resolving North Korea's nuclear crisis, and is even willing to meet Kim Jong-un if, he said, the circumstances are right. Clearly, the consequences of not talking are increasingly dire. That's all for now. I'm Dana Lewis. This was Inside.